Hello, back again at our inNOWvate supply chain event. Next, we have a great keynote speaker. It's always a pleasure to introduce her. So that's Professor Janet Godsell, Jan for France. She's Professor of Supply Chain Strategy at the WNG University of Warwick. So she's coming from practice, supply chain practice, but she has done a lot of research on supply chain matters. And she will talk about supply chain and sustainability. She's done a research about that. But there's some breaking news. So she's now professor in supply chain strategy, but she will be the dean of the Loughborough Business School. So she will stepping up to a role as dean. And the Business School of Loughborough is specialized in sustainability and sports. And I hope to continue to work with her in the near future. Also, what is the relationship of nature and sports and sustainability in supply chain? So that will be next for the future. But for now, Janet, I would like you to give the floor to your presentation about your research on sustainable supply chains. And if you have some trouble of clicking through your presentations, that's the biggest bottleneck in 2021 nowadays, especially online, you just do this and we go to the next slide. So Jan, take it away.
And I think it's worth saying that in my new role at Loughborough, I'm hoping that it's not just sport, but they do lots around engineering too. So it's quite exciting. Now, I can hear some background. Has the echo gone? Excellent. So I'm just waiting for my slides to come up. Excellent. And I think I've now got the clicker to work. So good afternoon, everyone. Maybe not. And also, I can't see my slides, So could I have the next slide, please? Or perhaps you can see it and it's just me that can't. So Martijn, I'm really sorry, but I can't see my slides.
Yeah, I understand. So we'll work it out. So
brilliant. Could we go back to the beginning of my presentation? And I think we'll just pretend that we're starting all over.
Yes, please do.
So good afternoon, everyone. What I'm going to share with you this afternoon is some work that we've been doing. In fact, we did it last year at the University of Warwick in conjunction with Blue Yonder. It was a huge piece of work because the topic of sustainability, circular economy, eco, you name it, there's so many different words for this area and it's so important, but what's the definitive source? And actually, when we started to look at this, we decided to do a systematic review and we identified over 600,000 different sources, from which we then identified the 108 critical data sources, which we then analysed in detail for the different themes. And it's that very detailed analysis that I'm going to share with you this afternoon. So actually, I think what all of this stems from, and it was my great pleasure to speak at inNOWvate back in October. But for me, fundamentally, what we need to adjust to is to actually think about the link between consumption and production. Because up until this point, all of our industrial evolutions have had a really strong connection between consumption and production. In fact, what we've essentially had is over 250 years of essentially consumption-driven economic growth. And as great people, far greater than me, like Sir David Attenborough, have rightly identified, it's this link between consumption and production that is beginning to destroy our planet and is also having detrimental effects for society. So as we move forward, we as industry need to work together to find better ways to make sure we can meet society's needs, but in doing so that we can decouple consumption from production. And fundamentally, at the heart of this, many of you may be familiar with the butterfly diagram from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. That essentially, many of our business models where we've coupled consumption and production, they follow that linear line down the middle where we essentially take stuff out the ground, we extract from it, we make primary materials from it, which we form into finished goods, which we then sell through retailers. And at the end of life, we might get a bit of valorization from it, but ultimately we send stuff to landfill. And I know that there's been some shocking figures in the news this week from the UK that even when we think we've perhaps sent things to even be recycled, that quite often those recycled materials aren't ending up as being recycled, they're ending up in landfill in other countries. Now, the principle of the circular economy is not necessarily just to follow that outer loop of recycling. In essence, that's the sort of least favorite loop. Fundamentally, what the circular economy about is trying to cycle through those more inner loops to find ways in which we can maintain products, in which we could reuse or redistribute products. We can remanufacture products, and it's only when we can't find ways of doing those things that we then seek to break them down and to recycle the materials in them. And so fundamentally, business models of the future should be business models that help us to keep products and serve in their highest possible value state for as long as possible. And so if we want to think of a world in 2035, what could that world look like? And fundamentally, what we did with that work that we did, looking with those over 600,000 sources, but coming down to those definitive 108 sources, what we did is really analyze those to be able to identify the different factors. In fact, we identified 53 different factors that, depending on how we choose to react, because actually the future is in our hands, we will craft that future. We came up with two different scenarios at I suppose, the extremes of our spectrum of reality. We've got the sort of utopia, which would be what we've called a flourishing world, and we've got the dystopian view, which essentially is the world on an edge, the world that we will create if we don't do anything about it. And I have to be very, very honest, the world on an edge is a very, very scary world, but it's the world that we are going to create if we just continue to follow the principles of the linear economy, because the world on an edge is a world where we are going to be incredibly resource constrained, and it's a world where we'll have scarcity. And from a manufacturing and supply chain perspective, this is a particularly unattractive world, because it's a world where those resource constraints have actually meant that the costs of raw materials have risen, the cost of manufacturing things is very, very high. And actually, we've created a lot of competition between our firms. It also means that as a result of that, there's going to be huge and severe pressure on our global systems. And what this is going to mean is that we're going to see a reduction in jobs in manufacturing across the world. Next slide, please. But perhaps what I want to spend a little bit more time contemplating with you is what we can create together if we create a world that is more flourishing. And in order to create this world that is more flourishing, fundamentally what we need to think about is how we embrace those principles of a more circular economy. And in doing so, what we will essentially start to see that we're going to change the landscape of manufacturing across the world. Because ultimately, what we are going to start to see is a world where we have a single global market with sufficient raw materials and resources. But interestingly, the trade flow of finished goods has decreased. And this has come about because actually what we are beginning to see is a much more regional view of the world, where actually different regions are beginning to compete on sustainability. And what they're beginning to generate is a high level of regional self-reliance. Now, this doesn't mean to say that we won't have any global trade, but fundamentally we'll only sell those things globally where there is, we can't actually source them more regionally. And this, from an organisational perspective, actually means for manufacturing that manufacturing firms are likely to enjoy increased profitability. They're likely to be able to focus on customer value creation, potentially by using much more interesting and different types of business models where IoT has enabled perhaps the provision of a service. We'll also see much more attractive cost structures because we're perhaps leasing products or paying per use rather than having to own things. And what we're also going to see is huge productivity gains. And from a manufacturing and supply chain perspective, we'll see regional manufacturing hubs that are developed both across the UK and in other countries within Europe and the world. We'll see the leveraging of these much more closed loop models to avoid risks from resource price fluctuations. And what we're going to see is a resurgence in employment, not necessarily in jobs in traditional manufacturing, but in those jobs that are linked to recycling, to reverse logistics, and to those secondary markets around upgrade, repair, and remanufacturing. And this really is a world for me that is incredibly exciting, because this is a world that could be much more socially leveling, because this is a world of much more distributed manufacturing supply chains. Because traditionally, if you think about it, our industrial evolutions today have been based on factories that essentially have the factory within walls. They've traditionally competed on economies of scale, with very, very standardized products, with large batch sizes, with very centralized positioning of those assets. Connectivity between them has been relatively low, as has the energy considerations, which have been particularly non-integrated and rather carbon intensive. And the integration with logistics has also been low, with the driver really being about profit and cost maximization, based on the principles of a linear economy, with very, very low consideration of the impact both societally and environmentally. So imagine a future where literally we're competing machine to machine, we're competing through economies of scope, potentially able to make customized products in a batch size of one at the same price as a mass-produced product. That we have much more distributed asset positioning, where connectivity is very high to enable this, and there's really, really strong integration with the low carbon energy sources that are powering these machines. And there's also very high integration with logistics, because essentially we don't see the difference between the two. And fundamentally, our driver is about responsible consumption and getting that balance right between responsible consumption and production, utilizing the principles of the circular economy, and really, really making sure that consumers are making decisions based on making trade-offs between environmental, social, and cost considerations. And so what I'd like to share with you is how we can light a path to this more flourishing world. And what our research identified was two drivers in particular, that of all those 53 factors, when we essentially reduced them down, there was two dominant factors. The first was the adoption of industrial digital technologies, and the second was the way in which we could integrate with supply chain partners, or supply chain integration. And if we match these two dimensions across each other, we essentially have identified 4 different business archetypes. Now, what I would like and what I hope is I can inspire you to become Pathfinders, but perhaps the path to Pathfinders, if your organization has yet to really embrace this journey, is to perhaps become an integrator or a technophile first. But what we want to try to do is to minimize the number of organizations that are what we'd see at the moment as being laggards. And let me explain a little bit more about these archetypes. So laggards are still organizations that are socially and environmentally aware. And from a strategy and organization perspectives, they set environmental goals, and they do consider their employee well-being, diversity, and equality. If you were to look at their sustainable marketing initiatives, they very much consider corporate social responsibility, particularly through promoting activities in society. So they may be sponsoring events or volunteering, and these could well be organizations that have got eco-labeling of their products. Within their factories and supply chains, you'll see efficiencies through reducing product defects and changeover times. They're beginning to repair, reassemble, and refurbish, though it's mostly done in secondary markets. And they are ensuring suppliers' compliance with working conditions, meeting all of the necessary environmental and compliance type of frameworks. And they do use auditing, monitoring, and resource consumption. Oh, sorry, they do auditing and monitoring of their resource consumption. And so essentially what they're doing is they're doing the minimum they need to meet the regulatory requirements. Now, integrators are organizations who have actually moved up on that dimension of improving supply chain integration. And these organizations you can perhaps begin to depict, they're the sort of organizations that are trying to bring everyone on board. And from a strategy and organization perspective, the types of things you'll see these organizations are doing is creating rewards and incentives for greener activities. And they also have much more specialist training for workers on environmental issues and actually on the circular economy. So you'll see a degree of upskilling. From a sustainable marketing perspective, these guys have moved beyond the basic CSR, and they're really looking at how they disseminate green good practices to their customers and with their supply base. And from an operational perspective, you'll see that actually they are beginning to change their network design. So you could see incidences of things like reshoring and nearshoring, definitely looking for more sustainable second source alternatives, looking at how they could recover and revalorize biomass waste and the likes, very committed to green and cleaner purchasing, and actually looking at extended producer responsibilities. And interestingly, these are organisations that don't just keep those practices for themselves, but they're very keen to share that up and down the supply chain and may even be thinking about user-centric design. And there are many organisations in this category. I'm just using an example here of Adidas, who interestingly have been really pursuing a lot of the green credentials, particularly within their supply base since the late 1990s. And whilst it may not have been fully successful, they had the very public opening of the customized plants in Bavaria, which I believe has now been outsourced to one of their suppliers. But they've really tried to look at what this means for their factory footprints. But really and truly, you can see much of this sort of greener and cleaner purchasing really embedded into Adidas's procurement practices and that desire to share their knowledge out amongst their supply base. Now, technophiles are organisations who make tech work for them. And this isn't just tech in terms of using tech to perhaps enable supply chain integration. So a lot of the sort of platform thinking, a lot of the work that we do around enhancing supply chain planning systems and enabling supply chain segmentation is stuff that's perhaps more, I suppose, orientated to actually improve supply chain integration. Technophiles actually are making those industrial digital technologies a fundamental part of the way that they're doing their business. And actually, they may be using that technology to overcome an existing issue with a product that actually enables them to compete in a totally different way. So these are companies that are perhaps using technology to make very asset-specific investments. And therefore, that's enabling them to potentially create product attachment through personalization, or designing products that actually really do create attachment and trust with their customers. And quite often these are supported by digital passports. And I suppose they're using this technology to enable sustainability in a range of different ways. It could be through a reduction in material consumption and packaging, through better energy efficiency, through novel disassembly and sequencing, or actually dematerializing by actually replacing a physical product with a digital product. And in some cases, and I'd say though, this is where there is some overlap with supply chain integration, it could be around how they use those digital tools to provide better transparency and traceability, or actually to create new bio-benign materials. Now, the example I'm going to use here is actually a Dutch company that's been around for a number of years, which is Dyco, who actually used the dyeing process, which we use for dyeing most of the fabrics that we'll use in the apparel and other industries, was a very, very water and energy intensive process. And Dyeco set about actually totally redesigning a new process that actually totally eliminated the need for water, full stop, took it totally out of the process. And at the same time, it replaced that water with CO2, but then actually used that CO2 in a closed loop, so that it wasn't actually contributing to CO2 emissions. So these are organisations that perhaps use technology to really define the way that they've done business, with sustainability really at the heart and at the core of what they do. And so this leads me on to, I suppose, our ultimate type of organisation, our Pathfinder. And our Pathfinders, I think we think about, these are the organisations that are lighting the paths forward. These are the trailblazers. And these are companies that, from a strategy and organisation perspective, they are really supporting awareness across that end-to-end supply chain. And they really have an organisational structure and culture that's set up for sustainability. And I know quite often at these sorts of events, and a lot of the work that Martijn does focuses on identifying the importance of the S&OP, or integrated business planning process. And one of the fundamental things about S&OP, or integrated business planning, is that it sort of sits neutrally at the core of your product, your marketing, and your supply chain strategy. And I think going forward, we often talk about the rise of the chief supply chain officer, but perhaps we should really be championing for that chief sustainability officer, and someone who sits at that nexus of the product, the marketing, and the supply chain strategy. Because to do this really well, you need that independence, but you also need cooperation with other firms, NGOs, the authorities, and the general public. And you need to be very, very product centric, and have environmental accounting right at the core of what you do. So we don't just make trade-offs on cost, quality, and time, but we make them on cost, quality, time, and carbon. And fundamentally, circular business models have to be at the core of this if we're going to break that link between consumption and production. And the things that you'll see in terms of operational practices could well be increased efficiency through IT and data management, better consumption preferences through the circular supplier, real proactive monitoring of resources, and waste decoupling. But just going on to my next slide, and I think this is an organisation who I know Martijn has close links to, and I've actually met through one of Martijn's executive forums. But HP is an organisation that has truly put the circular economy right at the centre of everything that they do. And if you think about those principles, you know, design for repair and reuse, design for recycled content, and design out waste and pollution, they've really, really thought about how they embed these principles in every aspect of what the organisation does. And the great thing about HP, if you do web searches, they try to make all of their good practice as accessible to everybody that they possibly can, which I think is a real sign of just their maturity. And so regardless of where you're at, fundamentally, the two simple pathways to improvement are either to improve your IDT adoption or to improve your supply chain integration. And I would argue, if you're a laggard, you potentially want to choose one of these two paths first, because to try to make that double step is probably a step too far. So if you want to set about improving your IDT adoption, some of the things that you need to overcome are your inability to integrate digital technologies, very, very high initial costs, which lead to financial risk, but also you may also be seeing product complexity too. And so the three suggestions we have for improving your IDT adoption, the first is to actually go back to a really, really old principle. So the scholar Fine from MIT, Charles Fine, he identified years ago in the 1980s through his work, his book Clock Speed, that we should be embarking on what he called 3D concurrent engineering, that we should design the product, the process, and the supply chain concurrently. Well, most organisations, they only design their product. They might do a bit of process, but there's very, very few organisations that have actually designed their supply chain. And what we're seeing now is that you almost need to do 3D concurrent engineering for the circular economy, not just thinking about that linear process, but thinking about it for all of those loops. And so in a way, you could argue this is like 3D CE squared. We also suggest the biggest blocker that we're seeing is fundamentally around the business case. It's quite hard to justify and get the right return on investment for an industrial digital technology. And so what we actually have been working with some organizations to do is to actually identify different ways of making a business case that better takes into account perhaps a shift to a more OpEx orientated business model. And last but not least, if you can create an integrative data backbone, then actually you could begin to de-risk your supply chain through the use of software as a service. Now, the second way that you could, or the other way that you could seek to begin to mature, is through improving supply chain integration. And for many organizations, this may be an easier first step than adopting industrial digital technologies. But the things you might need to overcome is that what we found is many organizations have an unclear vision across the supply chain. They're not like the Adidas's or the HPs that have shared that vision. They've kept it much more insular. And that's led to a lack of awareness in partnerships and collaboration, poor internal integration, and lack of supplier competences. And it might also be complicated by data privacy and security issues, fundamentally underpinned by trust issues. So first step is that you really need to, for those of you who've heard me speak before, you'll know this is one of my old chestnuts. We put lots of effort into developing MPI processes or CRM processes, and we need to finally put that same effort to create that end-to-end supply chain management process that spans right the way from our customers through to our suppliers. And then we need to think about how we can use clever integrative platforms. At the moment, I'm working on an inNOWvate UK project to develop a platform called Carbon View that doesn't just optimize the end-to-end supply chain, looking at cost, quality, and time, but it makes those trade-offs on cost, quality, time, and carbon. And it's going to be those types of platforms that really help us to make that change moving forward. And then finally, we need to overcome some of these trust issues by finding a more neutral language. Procurement departments are always going to want to argue about cost. But if we replace that unit of cost, that euro sign or pound sign, with something different, with units of carbon, maybe we can get supply chains to work together to really optimize the end-to-end carbon content and take away some of that tension that those debates around cash create. And you know what? We all like a good Gartner study. And, Gartner really do contribute to our friend by being able to do some of these definitive, cross-sector, cross-company studies. And what they've identified in this space, supply chain really has the authority to lead solutions, because we have the decision-making responsibility for about 85% of those decisions that we could make that link to circular economy strategies and initiatives. And so what I would urge you all to do is to seize that opportunity that Gartner has rightly identified that you have. You have the potential power. And what you need to do is, as decision makers within your organizations, we all have to decide, what world do we want to create? Are we going to continue along this linear path, a path that will is perhaps focused on profit optimization, is focused on pursuing the principles of a linear economy that is not considering where we get low carbon energy from, and is not thinking about how we decouple consumption from production, and that will ultimately by 2035 create a world on an edge? Or are we actually going to embrace those principles of the circular economy to truly think about how we can use those principles to repair, refurbish, remanufacture, and only recycle where we really need to create those new business models and that distributed manufacturing supply chain landscape that is going to enable us to decouple consumption from production and to be much smarter and more resource efficient in what we do, and to create a flourishing world, a world that is good for manufacturing supply chains, that is going to create new job opportunities, greater productivity, and essentially see a more sustainable future. And to quote a great philosopher, we are our choices. And I hope that I can inspire you to take some choices, albeit baby steps, by either improving your supply chain integration or improving your adoption of industrial digital technologies to be those pathfinders that take us on that journey to a flourishing world. Thank you for listening, and my apologies for the slight technical hiccups at the start.
No problem, you know. Jenna, thank you for this inspiring presentation. I started my presentation this morning about innovation, what it means. It means reinvent, rejuvenate, renew. And you make it practical to have a path forward, which path to follow to get to this flourish world. So thank you for this, and thank you for your work, and also in the future for more work in your new role as a dean.